Now, in the last lesson, you should have downloaded and unzipped the starting project. So go ahead and open it up inside Chrome and also inside Atom. So currently I've got the index.html, the index.js and the styles.css open side by side inside Atom. And I want you to have this same configuration so that we can work along with it together. Now, the first thing for you to do is to link up the index.js with our index.html and test it using an alert. So pause the video and go ahead and do that. So as we did before, we always put our scripts right at the end, just before the body closing tag, and we use the script with a source. So the source is of course index.js, and hit save, and then let's just give it a test, as always with a simple alert, just to make sure that everything is linked up properly and it's working. And so now inside our index.html, we've got a link to our style sheet, we've got a script that points to our index.js, and we're ready to begin. Now, at the moment, even though I have all of these buttons on my website, nothing actually happens when I press on them, right? Absolutely nothing happens. Now, in order to start registering the button clicks, I need to add what we call an event listener to it. So the buttons will let me know when a user clicks on it. Now, inside our index.js, let's first create a function that does something when the button gets clicked. So let's call this function handleClick, and it's going to take no inputs, but it will carry out an alert that says, I got clicked. And we basically want our button to trigger this function when it receives a click. So in order to do that, we first have to select our button inside the HTML and add an event listener that listens for when it gets clicked. And when it does, to call this function called handleClick. So first, of course, we'll need to tap into the document, and then we'll query selector for our button. Now, I'm only targeting the first button here, just so that we can see what's going on before we start trying to do this to all the buttons. All right, so now that I've selected my first button, the next step is to add an event listener. And the method for it is pretty much what it sounds like. It's add event listener. Now, if we take a look inside the documentation, as you always should when you're using a new method or a new property, then you can see that the method addEventListener sets up a function to be called whenever the specified event is delivered to the target. So the target in our case is the object that we're calling the method addEventListener on, which in our case is simply just going to be the first button on our web page. And then we're calling the method addEventListener. And this event listener usually has two parameters. The first one is the type, which is a case-sensitive string representing the event type to listen to. And if you click on this link, you can see all of the different event types that you can listen to. But in our case, we're just looking for something really, really simple, which is simply the click event, which means that the mouse clicked on the button. So let's go ahead and add that click event. And remember, we have to add it as a string. So that's the first parameter done. Now, what about the second parameter? Well, the second parameter is a listener. And this usually is a JavaScript function that's going to be called when that click event gets detected. So in our case, we're going to call our function handleClick. So what this line of code does is it finds the first button in our document, which is the WDrum button, and then it adds a event listener to that button so that it listens for clicks that happen on that button. And when it does, it runs the code inside the function handleClick. And that should send us an alert saying, I got clicked. So let's try it out. Let's refresh our website. And if you remember, I only added that event listener to the first button. So if we click any of these other buttons, still nothing will happen. But when I click on the first button, then you can see that we've got the message, I got clicked. So that means that this button is listening for every time that the user clicks on it. And we're able to get it to call a method every single time it does get clicked. So this is getting us closer to our goal, right? Now, event listeners are a little bit like when you're going to a party and you're asking your dad to pick you up. You're giving him an event listener by telling him to wait for a message from you that tells him to pick you up. And by doing this, you're essentially adding an event listener to your dad. Now, as the evening moves on and you're getting kind of bored with the party, you decide to message your dad. And when he receives that message, he will carry out a function, namely picking you up, right? That's what dads are for, I guess. So this is exactly the same thing that we're doing with our code. Now, the keen-eyed amongst you might have noticed that the way that we're calling our function is a little bit different from usual. Namely, we normally call our function with a set of parentheses. But in this case, we're not using it. Now, why is that? Well, let's see what happens when we do add the parentheses. So let's save and let's refresh our website. Now, you'll notice that immediately this alert gets called. And this is the problem. What happens is that our code will run and run and run until it hits the script tag, and then it'll go and find the index.js file that we specified in the script tag, and it'll run this line of code. Now, if we had the parentheses here, then this is a straight up method call, and it will call that method straight away when it's adding the event listener. Now, that's not what we want to happen. We don't want this function to trigger as soon as the event listener is added, right? No, we want it to trigger when the click happens. So in that case, instead of calling our function as we would with the parentheses, we're passing in the name of the function as an input. So that means that we're waiting for this click event to happen before we call the handle click function. And this is a bit of a logical jump that you'll have to make in order to understand a lot of things in JavaScript. It's the idea of passing a function as an input so that it can be called at a later time. Now, there's other ways that you'll see this part written out in the wild. The most common way is instead of adding a function name here that calls the function later on, most people will write this code as simply an anonymous function. So anonymous functions look pretty much exactly the same as a normal function, but they're just anonymous. They don't have a name. So this is what it would look like, and we can replace this part of the code with our anonymous function. So now you'll see it does exactly the same thing. Namely, when I click on the button, it goes and carries out the content of that anonymous function. And inside the parentheses of this anonymous function are all the instructions that you want to happen when that button detects the click. All right, so this is going to take a little bit of wrapping your head around, but I really want to challenge you with a small task. And the problem you have to address is at the moment, we're only adding an event listener to our first button because we're using query selector, which selects the first button in our index.html. Now, I want you to change this code or write some new code so that we're adding an event listener to every single button, so that no matter which button you click on, you'll always get this alert that says, I got clicked. Now, there's a really roundabout way of doing this, and there's a better way. And I want you to figure out what is the better way. And as a hint, it shouldn't take you more than 5 lines of code to do this. So pause the video now and see if you can figure out a way of adding the event listener that does exactly the same thing as what we've got here, but to all of the buttons. All right, so how did that go? Well, in order to solve this challenge successfully, you would have to recall that previously in our JavaScript lessons, we learned about loops. And loops are a great way of preventing ourselves from doing really tedious work. Because you might realize that you can say something like query selector all for button, and then you can say For the first button, add event listener. Then for the second button, add event listener. And on. And there's 7 buttons. So that's a lot of lines of code, which we are not interested in doing, right? So instead, what we can do is we can create a for loop. And remember, for the for loop, we start out with creating a variable I that's equal to 0. And then we specify the upper bound of I. So namely, when should our loop stop? And in this case, we want our loop to loop through 7 times because we have 7 buttons. And we can get that number 7 by simply saying document.querySelectorAll, and we're going to select all of the items that have the tag button. Now, this is a little bit dangerous because say if later on we decide to add another button, say in our footer, like a button that points towards our Twitter or our Facebook or whatever it may be, then this loop is also going to loop through all of those buttons, adding an event listener. So we should really be a little bit more specific with our selector. And if we take a look here, all of our buttons have a class of drum applied to it. So instead of just targeting button elements, we can be more specific and more safe by saying target all of the elements that have a selector of .drum. And remember, the dot specifies that this is going to be a class that we're targeting. So now we're looking through our document, querying for all of the elements that have a class of drum, and then we're going to call .length on it in order to see how many elements we've got that have a class of drum. And that number will help us determine when we should stop looping, because we essentially just want to loop through all of our buttons and add event listeners. So what better way of stopping our loop than figuring out how many buttons we have that has the class drum on it? Now, you can also separate this line out if you wish, and if it makes it clearer to you, by creating a new variable saying number of drum buttons, and you can set it equal to this. And then you can use that inside the for loop by saying start I from 0 and end when I is no longer less than the number of drum buttons. And finally, we're going to increment I by 1 each time. So now inside our for loop, we're going to use this part of our code, right? So we're going to paste that into here and maybe give it a little bit of space from everything else so you can see more clearly what's going on. And in this case, we're looking through our document, we're querying for all of the selectors that have the class drum, and then we're selecting each individual element from this array to add an event listener. So we want to start off with 0, and then the next time the loop runs, it'll be 1, and then it'll be 2. And this is where we put our I. So when this loop starts off, I is going to be equal to 0. So this is going to be equal to 0. So we get our first drum element. And then the next time that this loop runs, I gets incremented by 1. So this I is now equal to 1, and we get the next element, and so on and so forth. So now if we hit save and we refresh our website, then you can see that no matter which button we click on, we're always going to get the alert, I got clicked. So that event listener has been added to all of our buttons by using a for loop. Now, if you find it easier, in this case, you can also use a while loop. So while I is less than the number of drum buttons, or whichever way you found to be most effective. Now, what I didn't want you to do was to write out this code 7 times, changing the I from 0 through to 7. So if you had any problems with this challenge, then I strongly urge you to take a look back at the lessons in the JavaScript module where we went over this concept of loops, and maybe repeat some of the exercises and challenges so that you're fully comfortable with this before we carry on. But once you're ready, we're going to get started playing some sound. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.